I'd like to hear more about in what sense does one arrive at the end of a path, and in what sense one remains a seeker. In other words, is there a difference between a seeker and a wayfarer?
All right. Yes, I think there is a difference between a seeker and a wayfarer. And I think one needs to start by saying, yes, there are certain waypoints, or at least a significant waypoint on the path. But on the other hand, the path is infinitely deep or infinitely complex. The waypoint, and I suppose one could say the object or the objective of the path or of mysticism, is what is sometimes called the opening of the eye of the heart. And that is generally taken, I think, as an understanding or a realization of personal realization of the fundamental unity of God and the world, not in abstract terms, but in personal experiential terms. Again, returning to what I take as the classic definition of mysticism, that God can be known directly, and that knowing forms an objective or a milestone, often the milestone of the path, which is also called opening the eye of the heart. This opening and this knowing is, as it were, the transition between becoming a seeker and a wayfarer, to the degree that one wants to use that kind of language at all. I mean, all language is approximate, but these are ways of approximating this experience and its place in our own unfolding.
Well, yes, there is an end to seeking, and there is no end to learning, to seeing more,
knowing more.
And the eye of the heart, that's interesting. It just suddenly occurred to me that that may be the point at which you realize that the self that you thought you were is in fact the one self, and from then on you see from the heart rather than out the eyes, out the head, out those holes in your head. Anyway, it just struck me as,
that makes sense.
When you see through the false subject and realize there's only one subject experientially.
Yes, and that is certainly a realization and an awakening. And I guess arguably that can define a transition, which you could call the transition between seeking and wayfaring. But I think we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah, well, I can't speak much personally about with any authority, but there's a point at which you see the falseness of what you thought was yourself. And that's often a major awakening that coincides with that. But it may not be that abrupt.
No, and I think that occurs differently to different people, often in different teachings.
Well, yes, and in different degrees and different stages. I mean, I've seen a little bit of that, but I wouldn't say, but most of the time I think I keep making that same silly mistake every day.
Well, to some degree you're right, but to some degree you're wrong.
So that brings me into a question, which is, when one is on a path, a spiritual path, will they ever even ask this question to themselves, are they a seeker or a wayfarer at any point? For them who's traversing on a spiritual path, would the lines not become one? It wouldn't be a question from the way I see it.
I think it would be a transition at a certain point.
You were saying something?
Well, I know and have known some people who I consider really awake, and they consider themselves travelers. Nobody says I'm there.
You can see and experientially know the fundamental truth that we're seeking.
You know it personally and directly.
Yes, but that's not the end. There's still unfolding to go. Always more. After all, we do not live in a finite universe or a finite reality.
Are we answering your question?
If God created the world and the first law of thermodynamics is true, then how did God come into being?
I'm going to have to be reminded about which law is the first one.
The first one is the one that says that energy and matter can neither be created nor destroyed.
I see. All right.
The whole notion of questions like, how did God come into being, is so vastly beyond language and our ability to comprehend these things. all we can do is make up stories and approximate things that we think make sense. But finally, this is an unanswerable question. One has to accept things as they are. Because in order to answer, you have to sort of take a position above it and explain it. And that's silly. So this is not the kind of question I think that I can answer.
Well, I mean, if there is God the Creator, then did he or she wait until the world appeared to apply the first law of thermodynamics to it? Or say, let's have the world occur according to the first law of dynamics? Is it a law in the sense of a command for existence to behave, or is it a descriptive law?
And is it simply a property of this world?
Yeah, that's right. For that matter, we don't even know the first law of thermodynamics is true. Really.
You mean in some sense greater than we know in our little space?
Yeah, for all we know there are exceptions. We still don't know what goes on in black holes and white holes and anything else in the 11th dimension.
This is somehow reminiscent of the old question about, well, if God can do anything, can he make a rock that's so heavy even he can't lift it?
Well, yeah.
I think my point is that very, very often when I would speak to people that are atheists or agnostics, that they would bring up this question. And it's not so much that I was hoping for you to answer a question that no one in history has ever been able to satisfactorily answer, but more, what would you respond to someone that actually cares enough to ask this question, but yet currently doesn't believe?
I guess my approach to those people would be to say, how do you know? Are you sure? Where does the surety come from? How do you know what you know? Are you sure?
Did God create the world? And if so, out of what? And the first law of dynamics applies to matter, but is that the fundamental element, or is it consciousness?
Can I read something that is related to what we're trying to answer, but yet is not an answer?
Sure, go ahead. None of us have had an answer yet.
All right, so I'll read this out of the text, and it reads, God creates things, and they exist. The word exist is accurate in the metaphysical sense of ex, out of force, and sesere, to stand. Now, the things that exist are no longer purely part of the Godhead. So one can talk about the distance between pure God and created things. This distance is often described as a kind of movement away from the divine creative principle that sets it in motion. However, since God is the source of being, this movement away from God is ultimately in the direction of non-being, or almost paradoxically, of non-existence.
Yeah.
Is this you on your reading?
This is you?
Oh.
Well, it did.
Okay. Well, I think this is my understanding of Chuan's definition of evil.
So this is taken from the letter that was asking about evil and injustice in the world. But I thought this sums up really well, to an extent, what we're trying to comment on.
Well, yes, that is existence. But one could also say, what's the difference between existence and appearance? The world appears to us to be as we assume it is. That's the way it appears to us with our organs of perception and ignorance about its true nature.
Right, and I think that's what the distance is trying to also perhaps define that in another word.
Well, I have a little diagram stuck up somewhere that I made, and it has that, it represents the outward movement from the center, but it also has an arrow pointing the other direction, because there is a return. That's what the spiritual path is about. So there's something that does not go out and evaporate into nothingness, but returns home.
Yes, and I would say that all things that in fact are.
Building on these questions of science and faith, this wasn't one of the questions, but it came into my head. The Dalai Lama one time made the statement that if it were proven to him conclusively that reincarnation was absolutely not true, then he would simply move on with it and continue practicing.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that statement?
Well, if it's proof, he considers it proof, why would he do anything different?
Well, but also the question is, what do you mean proof?
Convinces the Dalai Lama, but in other words, if he had to throw out the whole concept of reincarnation, he would continue doing the spiritual practice that he does because it's good in itself.
Well, if I were in his position, I would say it can't be proven. What kind of proof are you talking about?
Well, I don't know, but this is the Dalai Lama that proposed
this. We're trying to take it from his statement, right?
And I think there's another question is whether he would tell anybody that he had seen that proof. Because it might be that even though one is supposed to not be focused on outcomes, I think there are a lot of people that might not start the path if they didn't think it was going to take them somewhere. Heaven, for instance. And the process may grow beyond the needs of the concept.
Well, I'd still start by saying there can't be any such proof. By what means do you create a proof like this?
I think the only
scientific proof. This is beyond the reach of this thing.
Yeah, not scientifically. The only proof would be to be physically dead and discover that there was no other form to follow. There wasn't a next stage.
I don't think Dalai Lama was making a value statement about whether or not this could ever be proved. I think his point was simply stating that the practice in itself, if hypothetically it was proven that all the metaphysics of religion are completely false, that the practice in itself still has value.
That's right. Yeah, that's what I think he meant too. It just wouldn't change anything for him. And, at this point where he has to consider whether he's going to have another incarnation, and he's playing that down because he doesn't want anybody to go out and think they found him. So, it sounds to me like it's not that important to him. Nor is it to me. I don't know what comes next. We've heard a lot of people use a lot of words and talk about it, but you don't know till you get there.
Right.
Right now, in this day and age, we're overwhelmed with choices, and in a certain sense, we're also overwhelmed with choices in terms of religion. But one of the things we tend to call ourselves are seekers after truth. But for someone that is seeking after truth, when there are different systems, metaphysical systems, that believe in things that are wholly contradictory, sometimes some people, and I can even speak for myself in saying this, that they follow something, but then they're like, oh no, what if I'm following the wrong path? I should follow something else. I mean, two things cannot both be true. What is your advice for those on the path that want to go after the truth, but realize that there are multiple traditions with competing eschatologies that both, at least in this worldly plane, cannot all be true?
I would say there's more than one skillful means.
Yeah, well said. For anyone, there's a big help.
Yes, it is. Not only that, but if you can see the truth in more than one religion, if you can accept that they're really both true, then inevitably relativizes some of the doctrine, which means you don't ignore it because it has something to tell you. It has something to show you, but it isn't necessarily the only way you can learn or see those things.
Well, but practically speaking, what you say to somebody is, you have a system that will take you all the way. And there are several reasons that you can know that. And as such, you can find these other systems interesting and sometimes helpful, but they will contradict at the level of language and mythology and example the things from your own system.
Right.
Then the question isn't which one is true, but
it's the question of which one are you following and what's wrong with yours,
I suppose.
I guess someone that overthinks things could think, well, on the one hand, let's say reincarnation is true and the Judeo-Christian Islamic version of eschatology is false, or vice versa. Well, if one is true and the other is false, then who's to say that the one that has the false eschatology has a practice that can get us to the end of the path?
doesn't the question arise of who is calling it true or false? Who is doing the sort of qualification of what is true and what is false?
Well, and it also, I would say anybody that has that question should pick a path that makes perfect sense to them and not look one way or the other. Because we have traditions that say you reach your heart's desire and your ultimate purpose by following this path.
And for me, it's the example of the prism, you know? You get white light that refracts itself into all of these colors. And every color can assure everybody in that color that it can follow that color all the way back to the uncreated white light. But there are other colors, and they can make the same proposition, but you can't compare the two in terms of their effectiveness from one to the other. Unless you're a perennialist, in which case you see the prism.
Yeah, and you can't say there's no difference between red and blue.
Right. God knows there have been wars fought over this. We know the blue path is true. The saints and sages of blue have affirmed that over centuries. We know blue is true. And suddenly we've got red around us, and we know blue is true, so this is why we have religious wars, I suppose.
Yeah, which end up destroying the prism.
Right. Are we attempting to deal with your question?
How does one combat spiritual burnout?
Well, that's a question I hear a lot.
Yeah, that's the same thing as the spiritual desert, the dry periods.
Help realize part of the territory. It's part of the spiritual territory.
Right, and it helps to realize that everything will pass.
Yes, it helps to know that, and it helps to know that things come in cycles. Everything comes in cycles. And periods of aridity come with time.
Come with their own opportunity.
But I have my own answer to this question, because I do get asked it a lot. And my response is, first of all, relax. Don't dwell on it. Add one item to your practice. Doesn't really matter what it is. Find something that you have an affinity with. It may be walking meditation. It may be chanting. It may be single-point meditation, whatever. And do that diligently, and let me hear from you in a couple months.
Yeah. If you don't like the territory, you don't like what you see where you are, change something.
Yes, you need to get a little different view of the same territory. And you can do that by taking a step to the side, or backwards or forwards, or changing your angle of vision. And you might be surprised at what you see.
Right. And there's also the question of expectations. I mean, does one assume that it's always going to be easy and your Gnost is not going to whisper discouraging things to you sometimes? I mean, it's difficult, and you may, in fact, go through a period of time where you feel like nothing is happening and all of that. But it's a little bit like depression.
A lot like depression.
Because you need to know that that's not the fundamental truth, and when you're depressed, you tend to feel like you'll never get out of that state. It's always going to be that way. Life is never going to have any meaning. And you just have to know that there's no absolute truth to the experience of spiritual burnout.
Right.
There's no absolute thing about depression. It too can pass.
It's interesting that you make the analogy with depression, because I also know many people that have something like spiritual bipolar. So that I've known one person for 10 years, every 3 months will go to spiritual retreats, itikaf, pray all night, do everything, even like carry a miswak around and brush their teeth with the twig, and then 3 months later they're like drinking and partying and everything else and don't want anything to do with religion. And every 3 months, pretty much, for 10 years, it's exactly the same thing, back and forth, back and forth. What would your suggestion be to them? And do you think that part of the problem is too much religiosity?
Well, it sounds like it's too much alcohol, too.
Yeah, I would say moderation in all things.
Well, yes, you can say that, but the real problem is that the person is cycling. How to come to terms with that? For one thing, it shows how unreliable and unreal one's personality is. But I would tell somebody like that, make it the most important thing in your life to catch the transition between those states and see what it teaches you.
Can you say
carried
that
off
again?
by it.
I'd say make it your most important goal to observe the transition from the spiritual to the decadent state and vice versa. What changes?
I think that's excellent advice.
Because if you can catch it early, maybe you don't have to go into the next cycle. And even if you do go into the next cycle, if you've caught it, you know something. You're going to be smarter the next time around. Get to know your states.
Advaita, does this person know that their life makes no sense this way?
Yes. I've told them that their life makes no sense this way. And I no longer do that because I think the person actually gets more depressed then, and then they engage in self-destructive behavior.
But they know they cycle.
They know they cycle, for sure. Definitely.
Yeah. Well, I would encourage them to study how it is that they get from point A to point B and back to point A. And I would say, what changes? And then I would say, what is it that never changes, regardless of which phase of the cycle you're in? Because that's really what matters. I mean, you're bigger than either of those states. And the proof of that is that you're aware of both of them. You're the same person who knows both of these states. So neither of those is actually who you really are. So find out what that real part is that doesn't change. And you have plenty of opportunity, if you go through these two very, very different states, plenty of opportunity to see that A is not the answer and B is not the answer. But perhaps that which is there the whole time is.
The only thing that I could add is that my intuition tells me that many of the people that cycle tend to have a religiosity based on fear of God rather than love of God. That those who love God have a more steady path, whereas those that are overwhelmed with fear tend to have more ups and downs. But that's just my intuition.
Well, I'm sure that's true. Fear is just awful. It drags you around all kinds of different ways. And finally, a spiritual path is one of overcoming fear.
Yes.
Because you must take the next step into the unknown many times. And you kind of have to not necessarily be truly fearless, but you have to gain some objectivity about your fear, not let it own you.
Well, it's difficult to talk about cases like this in principle.
Yes.
It's easier to talk to an individual who has this problem.
The way I look at the book, though, partially, is giving advice to people that either are unable or unwilling to seek out, let's say, a spiritual teacher. And I think in some ways the way we're going to get the best advice into the book is by sometimes bringing up examples either that are hypotheticals or, even better, bringing up examples from real people with real problems.
All right, I think that's true.
Yeah. And another question for this not quite hypothetical person is, does this person want to get out of this cycle, get off of the wheel?
Do they know they're caught by something?
Yeah. Do they want to be free of it? Or are they content to just be a little confused about why they go back and forth, but just continue to do it? Because maybe each one is exciting, especially if it's a kind of bipolar thing. Although one of them may be excited, that may be the religious part, and the other may be depressive with all the alcohol. I don't know, but you really have to be dissatisfied. It's kind of like getting to the point where they talk about in Alcoholics Anonymous, and they say, I had to find something entirely new, something higher than me, because my best thinking got me where I was. Waking up in the gutter somewhere, well, my best thinking got me here. I'm going to have to find something bigger than me.
Yes, I need to turn my life over to something that's different, bigger.
More powerful.
Isn't that what alcoholics refer to as reaching bottom?
Well, that's a description of bottom that some people in AA use, especially when they're talking to somebody who's still trying to figure everything out. Gets into a spiritual program and wants to figure it out and wonders, if they're doing it right, and has all this. And they'll also say that I thought I had a problem with drinking, but it really was that I had a problem with thinking. So, anyway, and certainly the alcoholic example, a lot of these people, they get clean and they hold down a job for a while, but then all of a sudden that demon reaches out and grabs them, and generally they can't get out of it until they realize that they have, well, as you say, hit bottom, or that they have exhausted their possibilities, and they have proven to themselves that they just don't know what to do.
Well, it's terribly difficult to try to help somebody who doesn't know they have a problem. It's easier to help somebody who won't admit they have a problem, but it's harder to help somebody who doesn't know they have a problem. And if they know they have a problem, then you, in principle, have something to work with. You can take what it is they know and what it is they respond to or find good or valuable or positive and try to increase that or try to rely on that or add things that facilitate that particular interest, aspect, or part of their being that's positive and can stand in the face of all of this.
Yeah, the thing you can hang on to can be a higher power. It could be that thing that's always present and sees you in the one who experiences you in every state, and to realize that's truly you, not these. The ocean is really the ocean. It's not all those waves during a big storm, all those standard kind of things. But the thing that doesn't change, that's who you really are. You're not the one who goes off on spiritual retreats and fasts for weeks and does things like that, and you're not the one that goes out and parties and drinks. You're the one who sees you do both of those things.
Right.
There are a number of ways to sort of get past and point to something the person has not considered before. Because generally people in that state think they're always the same person, but they think that same person keeps doing all these things. But the person who's the same is the one who sees it.
Right, not the one who does the different things.
In that specific case, the person holds down a good job. They drink when they do this stuff, but not in an alcoholic way. It's more like no more than, let's say, any secular Western person would. But I think one of the big issues here is that they have deep depression and they refuse to engage in modern Western medicine, so they go to Islam to solve it. But when all of their praying doesn't cure their depression, then they turn to the other side.
Seek relief, yeah.
And what would you say about that? Would you say that someone in that case should seek Western psychiatrists and, let's say, Western psychological medicine compatible with the path?
I'd say if you're willing to put alcohol in your system to try to help, why don't you try something? Why don't you try an antidepressant or a mood-stabilizing antipsychotic or something like that?
Well, I agree. And generally, my approach to the depression question is start by checking your physiology. Because there's so many things that affect mood. Nutrition, day-night balance, hormone balance.
I just read statins can, for some people, create dramatic personality changes. That was a surprise.
Could be. So the first thing I tell people to do is to check their physiology, because that's responsible for a lot, and that's one of the things that Western medicine does address fairly readily. That may not solve the problem, but is often a good first step.
That's right.
Not only that, taking action is a great way to start addressing depression.
Yes, something concrete.
City, that's 100% true, and I'll give you an example of how true that is. That there was another person that I knew for probably 40 years of their life. They felt debilitating depression, and they tried everything. They went on antidepressants and all of that. It never helped. They were suicidal. It was horrible. And then, sometimes Western medicine's too quick to prescribe, let's say, antidepressants, but it turned out that they actually had celiac disease, which is an autoimmune allergy to wheat, and they weren't getting enough vitamin D in their system. And as soon as they stopped eating gluten and started having vitamin D supplements, they're the cheeriest person on the planet.
Well,
that's a happy ending.
That's a happy ending. Thank you. Again, my first response to somebody who talks about depression.
Yeah, make sure you're really, get blood tests, make sure you're really healthy. Make sure your body is healthy.
Yes, and having a stray hormone or daylight disorder is not a character flaw.
Well, and there is no clear distinction between mind and body when it comes to medicine.
Yes, and these things are terribly interrelated.
Yeah.
So the next question was something that came to me while I was reflecting on the text. And so I should read the text, which is a few sentences, just to bring the context and then ask the question. So this is what the text reads. To attain insight requires stepping beyond the library and into the heart. It requires a transformation of the self. It requires taking more risk than most are prepared to take, more self-scrutiny than they are prepared to tolerate, and more openness than they can stand. Yet, this is the very stuff of the path of God. The reason people fail on this path is not that they lack the brains, but that they lack the courage. So now the question I have is, could you elaborate on this by sharing some personal learnings on the way and some things that you encountered whilst in the path that otherwise you wouldn't have encountered?
That's something I wrote.
Yes.
Okay.
But I guess it could do with some fillers of personal learnings on the way.
Well, let's start out getting past the library into the heart. We're talking, it can't all be mind learning. It has to be experiential. You feel it. And transformation of the self, the way I'm sort of looking down along that sentence, and that thing about taking risk, more risk than most are prepared to take, because they think they have more to lose than they really do.
Well said. I think that's great.
To really get to know the self that needs to be transformed is to discover how much of it is not that, is not that important, and that you're willing to lose it in order to get free of its tyranny. Self-scrutiny is the way to do it.
And it actually does take courage, particularly if you're going to change.
It takes courage to see straight on and clearly that many of the things you thought were your treasures are really hideous.
Yeah.
And some people simply cannot stand that, and that's where they quit. But what do you need a spiritual path for if you don't have things in you that are problems?
Right, even though it's often more comfortable to have the problems than it is to try to get rid of them, which takes strength and courage. The other thing that takes courage is the notion of understanding that there is such a thing as death, which we spend a lot of time in this culture denying.
Well, right. That's true. You'll be dead in the end anyway. Why not do something while you're here?
Right, and generally people find it such an important topic or such a complete mystery that it can only be avoided.
Yes, and finally, most fears are fears of death.
Yes, I suppose that's true.
At their root.
Fear of the unknown.
Yes, but it's because you might come to an end in that unknown, or some precious part of you might have to come to an end.
That's one of those parts you're so attached to.
But, you have to die before you die.
Exactly. I feel like we're not answering your question.
So, especially when you're talking about courage or the lack of, what did that mean in your personal journeys? What would you say you did something that you never thought you would to discover the lowercase self?
Joining this crazy Tarika. I mean, isn't that a big risk? It's a transformation of the way you live. And when you could say it took a lot of courage, but at that point, looking at what seemed to be at stake, it was a very reasonable thing to do and not so scary. There wasn't that much fear.
Yes. One of the difficulties with this question is when you talk about what fears did you face, that kind of thing, you try to call up life's most fearful and difficult moments and see what those have to offer. And that's, I think, inaccurate skewing of the question on the part of the listener, when in fact, every worthwhile act is preceded by a kind of resistance that is necessarily addressed with a kind of courage. Whether it's time to say the prayer, or whether it's going into halwa for a day or two or three, or whether it's having a particular conversation or asking a question, before every important act is a kind of resistance that is addressed with determination and courage.
Yeah. And hopefully along the way you pick up enough of the wisdom of not taking yourself so seriously.
Well, there's a good idea.
Because you can be stuck in a pretty deep rut, but at least it has familiarity to offer you.
Yes, I've seen that so often. It's a terrible rut, but it's my rut.
This is what I know. I don't know what I'll find if I do something different. Well, that's right, you don't. And you can't. And that's why it's hard to talk about things on the spiritual path. I mean, for the longest time, I felt like I needed to know where I was going.
Sure.
And I didn't go anywhere until I gave up on that. It's not quite that simple, but you can't know. By the very nature of the path, you're venturing into the unknown. And if you're on a Gnostic path, your goal is to know what you don't know, which means you have to step into the unknown. There's no way around it.
Right. Well, I think that's a really good answer, and also maybe understanding the actual statement in a different way. All right, so the next question is about what is spiritual listening and how can one practice it?
I need more specifics. Are you talking
Yes,
about...
so do I.
About be still and know that I am God, or are you talking about listening to other people?
No, the former.
Oh, all right.
Well, be still is pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to hear something that is hard to hear, how quiet can you get?
Well, this is a matter of paying attention, right? That's what we're really talking about.
Right. So how do we pay attention? And how can we practice paying attention, I guess?
Well, that's largely the discipline of the path. One starts by paying attention to what one can, and then one adds various tools and techniques to one's ability to pay attention so that it can be refined or expanded or understood, that's not the right word, experienced in more fullness. It's all about what's called here spiritual listening.
And can you step back from your thoughts? You may not be able to turn them off. Sometimes you can, and it's really nice, but you can't expect them to. I mean, after all, how much control do you have over your thoughts? They pop up whether you want them or not. It's one thing to have thoughts, it's another thing if your thoughts have you.
Okay.
But, quiet, mindful meditation, really. I mean, can you be quiet and just observe without contributing anything? I mean, you can have the name on your breath if you wish, and I find that helpful. But spiritual listening, how quiet can you get? And how undistracted can you get? Spiritual listening. It's not like you'll necessarily hear anything either. You might think something or see something.
Right.
Or feel something. Feel a deep sense of relief and say, hey, this is real. So spiritual, you could be in a totally dark room and do spiritual viewing too, I suppose. But I think the listening is usually offered as a complement to prayer. Don't be talking all the time. Spend time listening. And along that line, in the same spirit, although not using sound, pay attention to what God is doing with your life right now. In other words, you can be watching too. And God is always there. And we say we don't hear Him or we don't see Him. But how could it be possible that we...
He's always there.
So the spiritual listening.
Yeah. And I would say a key element of spiritual listening is to realize that you're not hearing something other than God. If you want to know what God's will is, see what He's doing with your life.
Right now.
Yeah, in every moment.
Well, I'm pretty content with this. Alhamdulillah.
All right. Alhamdulillah. Good for you. Yes, alhamdulillah.
you.